Hello, I'm Russell Haythorn with Denver 7, and welcome to Denver Decides. This community partnership is dedicated to accessible and transparent elections. The partnership includes the League of Women Voters of Denver, Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation, and is presented by Denver 8 TV. Our mission today is to present a ballot issue forum in anticipation of the general election coming up on Tuesday, November 3rd. Among the numerous amendment and ordinance questions on the ballot this year is Proposition 114. Proposition 114 is a measure that asks voters, should Colorado reintroduce gray wolves on certain lands west of the Continental Divide? Our format for this forum will follow a basic debate outline with opening and closing statements, cross-examination, and will include responses to the questions submitted by our forum organizers. Let's begin by meeting the participants who will present and discuss the pros and cons of Prop 114. And this is a special occasion for us here at Denver Decides and Denver 8 TV. I would like to welcome members of Denver's George Washington High School speech and debate team to the forum tonight. These young people will be debating this proposition on the forum. So beginning to my right is Lily Clark, who is a senior at George Washington High School, and she will be speaking in favor of the proposition. And to my left is Eli Valor Kaplan, who is currently also a senior at George Washington High School, and he will be speaking against Proposition 114. Welcome to you both. And now to our opening statements. You guys can remove your masks. We will begin with a 1-minute, 30-second opening statement from both of our speakers. Lily, you will go first. And so without further ado, Lily, you can argue in favor of Prop 114.
Thank you. Colorado voters should vote yes on Proposition 114, in which the once extinct gray wolves will be carefully reintroduced to the natural environment. Doing so will return a sense of equilibrium to the ecosystem. Historically, gray wolves, who have been largely eradicated in Colorado, play a critical role in regulating natural environments. You should vote yes for two key reasons. First, gray wolves will help to regulate the currently uncontrollable populations of elk and deer. Following the elimination of their primary predator, they've grown sedentary, and as a result, surrounding vegetation has grown scarce. This has two consequences. One, it causes erosion in our rivers and streams, which has led to a loss of fertile land, worsens flooding, and pollutes our waters. Two, it forces large populations of deer into the cities, causing extensive property damage and making driving more difficult. By reintroducing gray wolves, populations of deer and elk will move around more frequently, allowing vegetation to grow and recover. When the environment in the mountains is better suited to support the deer and the elk, they will no longer move down into the cities. Second, gray wolves will help to create healthier and more resilient animal populations. Overpopulation is allowing for disease to sweep through herds. Wolves are able to weed out sick and weak members of deer and elk populations, as was seen when gray wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone several years ago. To create a more balanced and healthy ecosystem, voters should vote yes on Proposition 114.
Way to go, Lily, right on time. And now, Eli, it's your turn. You're speaking against Prop 114.
Colorado voters should vote no on Proposition 114. Enacting the bill could cause dangerous environmental impacts and constitutes unnecessary government action. Gray wolves have been extinct in Colorado since 1945, and due to changing ecosystems, human development, and climate change, the Colorado that gray wolves used to live in is very different than today's Colorado. Forcing wolves into an unprepared environment could cause catastrophe for all those involved. While this proposition seeks to bring back gray wolves into Colorado, they actually already are coming back. Colorado Parks and Wildlife reported wolf sightings in 6 of the last 15 years, including both 2019 and 2020. The environment would be better prepared if wolves were able to naturally reintroduce themselves into Colorado. The people of Colorado would also be much better prepared if this process was able to be done naturally in accordance to the environment. Proposition 114 would force a complex environmental issue to be decided not by scientific experts working in their field, but in the ballot box, which could cause problems. It leaves little flexibility and a lot of room for environmentally damaging choices. Our environment is important, and Coloradans should not have to spend money forcing a natural process that is already happening. For all of these reasons, we should vote no on Proposition 114.
Eli, Lily, thank you for your opening statements. Now, Eli, you will have 1 minute for a rebuttal to Lily's opening statement. Eli?
So Lily stated that the deer's main predator has been eradicated from Colorado. But nowadays, humans are usually the main predator. This is because people are often the ones hunting deer. Lots of money is made for the Parks and Wildlife Service of Colorado through hunting licenses that people pay for hunting deer. This hunting can not only keep the deer population in check, but also makes money for the services that protect our state's environment. Forcing wolves to relocate to Colorado could hurt not only local ranchers, but also dissuade deer hunters. With competition for deer and the fear of an unfamiliar predator, many potential hunters could decide against buying licenses. Lily also makes the assumption that wolf reintroduction will be effective in controlling the deer population. However, this could be untrue. It's based largely off of the effectiveness of the Yellowstone reintroduction programs. However, Yellowstone and Colorado are incredibly ecologically different. The wolf population has been missing for well over half a century, extinct since 1945. And because of this, we cannot make the assumptions that Colorado reintroduction will have the same impacts as Yellowstone reintroduction.
Eli, thank you for that rebuttal. Now, Lily, it is your turn to offer a rebuttal to Eli's opening statement.
Okay, so Eli first tells you that we shouldn't reintroduce wolves due to changes in their original habitat, but I would argue that this is actually a reason to vote yes on the proposition. By reintroducing gray wolves, we can prevent further change, such as growing deer and elk populations and river erosion from occurring. With the problems that Eli presents, such as urbanization and climate change, it's better to address uncontrolled populations, disease, and harms to the environment now. Furthermore, when Yellowstone reintroduced gray wolves, they didn't experience any of the drawbacks that Eli presents. Eli then argues that we shouldn't vote yes on 114 because gray wolves are already beginning to return to Colorado. But what he neglects to tell you is that this is happening in such small numbers that none of the potential benefits have materialized. They are moving far too slowly to establish stable populations of wolves. It is far better that we use taxpayer money now because it will ultimately save us money in the long run, as we will no longer have to repair the damage caused by uncontrolled deer and elk populations.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you, Eli. And now we're moving on to cross-examination. This is round one of cross-examination. And during this round, beginning with Lily, you can ask Eli a question. So Eli, you will have 1 minute to reply to Lily's question. Lily, go ahead.
Okay, so you tell me that it's better for the wolves to return naturally, but can you give me an example of where gray wolves were purposely reintroduced where we saw significantly negative outcomes?
The problem with this is that in lots of areas, it is important for wolves to be introduced because they were so recently taken out. However, Colorado, this is a different story. Because wolves were eradicated 75 years ago, the environment has changed a lot. And so it's important that when we're reintroducing them, we're being a lot more mindful about how this happens. Reintroduction processes can be incredibly successful. However, those are often in other states with other population densities and other environments. Because of the environment of Colorado, we need a slower wolf reintroduction simply because the environment and the people are not used to having gray wolves in the area.
Continuing with cross-examination round one, Eli, now it's your turn. You can ask Lily a question, and Lily, again, you will have 1 minute to answer.
In other reintroduction programs, had wolves been missing for as long as they have been in Colorado?
Okay, so what I think the argument that you're trying to get at here is that, like, we can't compare what's happened, for instance, in Yellowstone to what's happening in Colorado. But I would argue that, one, we already know that the environment is suitable for wolves to return because, as you yourself tell me, wolves are already returning in the status quo. So if we were going to see harms from wolves returning, we would have already started seeing them. That's not the problem here. So, like, ultimately, it doesn't matter if, like, in the Yellowstone project, wolves hadn't been missing for as long as they had been in Colorado. Ultimately, what we can see is, one, the environment is suitable for them to thrive here, and two, that it's super important that they are reintroduced.
Very good. Thank you, Lily. Moving on, cross-examination round two. And let's begin with Eli in this round. Eli, your turn to ask Lily another question during cross.
In the midst of a pandemic and economic struggles, is now the best time to focus Coloradan taxpayer money on relocating wolves?
I think honestly using the pandemic now is just an excuse not to get something done. If we don't do it now, when will we? We can see that the problems that this is creating are affecting Coloradans right now. Just because it might not be on the scale of a national pandemic doesn't mean that it's not critical that we use resources to combat that. As we can see, like overwhelming deer and elk populations are hurting Coloradans as they move closer to the cities. It's causing problems with our rivers. So honestly, yes, because like it doesn't matter if a pandemic is happening, because it's critical that we solve this problem now, especially considering like the changing environment with climate change, because like there's always an excuse not to do something. If we don't do it now, when will we?
Thanks, Lily. Continuing with cross-examination round 2, and Lily, your turn. You can ask Eli a question, and Eli, again, you'll have 1 minute to respond.
Okay, so can you give me a rough estimate as to how many wolves have returned to Colorado in the last 15 years?
Once again, in the last 15 years, there have been 6 reported years, 2 of them including this year and 2019, where there were confirmed cases of wolves being sighted. The Parks Service is not very focused on exactly how many wolves, because obviously for a long time wolves haven't even been living in Colorado at all. However, we are seeing an increase in wolves, showing that those numbers are trending upwards. They may not be trending upwards as fast as if we introduced wolves into the environment unnaturally, but that is probably a good thing, as it reflects the natural course of a natural environment as opposed to human interaction with wolves and the place that they live in.
Eli, thank you. Lily, thank you. Moving on, cross-examination round 3. And Eli, I believe we'll start with you. Your turn to ask Lily a question, and Lily will have 1 minute to respond.
Would relevant experts in Colorado's ecology get a voice in the process of reintroduction?
Yeah, so you mentioned this a bit in your rebuttal, trying to make the argument that like this is something that we're just doing like with no evidence behind it just because the voters want it, but that's really not true. If you look at the bill itself, there's a commission that's in charge of reintroducing wolves into the environment, and they've stated before that they'll do that using the best scientific advice and evidence that they can. It's not just some like willy-nilly decision. It's backed by scientific evidence, which shows that reintroducing gray wolves to Colorado is the best option for the environment.
Thank you, Lily. Lily, your turn. You can ask Eli a question, and Eli will have 1 minute to respond. You guys are doing great, by the way.
So you tell me in your rebuttal that hunters are now assuming the role as predator instead of the gray wolf. So if this is true, why are we still seeing problems such as like overpopulation and harms to the environment from deer and elk?
Well, I think when it comes to harms to the environment, it's hard to put that on the shoulders of the deer. A lot of scientists agree that many of the harms to our environment come from ourselves. I think it's hard to write that off as a natural thing. But also when it comes to humans as the point of hunters, it's very clear why we don't want humans to overhunt the deer and instead to maybe slightly underhunt them. That's because when we overhunt deer, it could lead to their extinction in the region. We can also see that the fact that there is a slightly larger deer population is actually good, because this means that as the wolves are able to come in, then they are doing so in an environment that has deer for them to hunt. But also because there is such a large deer population who are not used to having wolves hunt them, if we all of a sudden introduce a bunch of wolves, they likely will not be able to behaviorally cope with this new predator.
Eli, thank you very much for that response. I'd like to remind our viewers at home that both Eli and Lily join us from George Washington High School. They're both seniors, and they're both part of the speech and debate team at George Washington High School, which I believe is the #1 debate team in the state and the #4 debate team in the country right now. So congratulations to you both. Moving on to cross-examination round 4. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong about those rankings. If you're ranked higher, please
Nope.
correct
I
us.
believe that's
You
right.
got
If you're
it
ranked
right.
lower, don't correct us. Lily, we'll start with you. Cross-examination round 4. This is the last round of cross-examination. You can ask Eli a question.
Okay, so let's go back to this like idea about hunters. So are hunters truly going to fear like buying licenses with the presence of the gray wolf when there have always been predators like present when hunting?
Obviously, there have always been predators present when hunting, but I think the issue here is the idea of this predator that hasn't been there in a long time. The gray wolf is not something that Colorado hunters often have to deal with, and so there is almost an aspect of fear that they are going to have to face. There are a lot of negative connotations about the gray wolf, some of which may be untrue, but could still affect hunters in the decision-making process. So even though there are already predators, because this predator is being introduced into the environment and is unaccustomed to it, it could still add a dissuading factor when hunters are making their decisions about whether or not to buy a license.
Eli, thank you for that. Now, Eli, your turn. Cross-examination round 4. You can ask Lily one more question. Lily will have 1 minute to respond.
So would any measures be put in place to stop wolves from entering highly populated areas?
I would argue that it doesn't even matter if measures are being put in place because there's no reason for wolves to enter highly populated areas. We can see that historically wolves have entered highly populated areas because their prey have been hunted by humans to such an extent that they no longer have food. But right now, as we can see that elk and deer populations are so high, wolves have no incentive to enter populated areas. So I really don't think that's a issue that needs to be addressed. It's not going to happen.
Thank you both for that cross-examination round during this debate on Proposition 114, the proposed reintroduction of gray wolves in Colorado. Now we're moving on to the card questions submitted by the forum organizers. A reminder to our viewers at home again that both of these speakers are students, seniors actually, at George Washington High School and members of the debate team there. This round, each speaker will have a couple of questions submitted, again, by the forum organizers. Each speaker will answer each question, and you will each have 1 minute to respond. So, Lily, we'll start with you. Lily Clark, a senior at George Washington High School. And here's the first question from forum organizers. The organizations opposed to this measure are predominantly groups associated with ranching, hunting, and farming in Colorado. Why are these groups against the reintroduction of wolves when the state says it will, quote, pay fair compensation for losses due to wolf activity? Lily.
I honestly think it comes from a negative connotation of the behaviors of gray wolves. Ultimately, what we're going to see is that for everyone in Colorado, the reintroduction of gray wolves is beneficial. So especially considering that Colorado has promised to reimburse ranchers and anyone else for property damage or loss to livestock, this really shouldn't be a concern, especially as we've mentioned before, elk and deer populations are so high that wolves won't need to interfere with livestock. I think honestly this fear is just poor public perception of gray wolves when ultimately we can see that it'll be very beneficial.
Thank you, Lily, for that response. Eli, same question on the topic of wolves and compensation for loss of livestock. Your response.
Well, I think one of the reasons why there is so much negative perception about wolves is not only because wolves have occasionally hunted livestock, but also because of the government program for reimbursing is actually incredibly hard. For lots of ranchers, it can be difficult for them to prove that it was in fact a wolf attack that hurt their cattle. And so because of this, not only is there the fear of wolves, but there's also the fear that they could actually be in economic trouble because the wolves have been reintroduced into this habitat.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Lily. Our second question from the forum organizers, and Eli, it'll be your turn to respond first. And this is on the topic of benefits. In what ways are gray wolves beneficial to the Colorado ecosystem, if at all?
Well, I think a lot of the reasons that gray wolves are beneficial to the Colorado ecosystem is because a lot of Colorado constitutes a natural environment. And that's what's so important about the gray wolves, is that they're able to come here naturally. It can cause problems when the government gets in the way and is able to bring them into the environment that they don't understand about, instead of letting them migrate to Colorado from other places that they already understand.
Eli, thank you for that response. Lily, same question. In what ways are gray wolves beneficial to Colorado's ecosystem?
So a few things here. One, we can see that reintroducing gray wolves will be incredibly beneficial to Colorado citizens, like on a level that they can actually feel. As I've mentioned previously, deer and elk populations have remained in the same place for extended periods of time because they no longer have a predator forcing them to move. This means that they are reducing vegetation down so low that we're seeing erosion in our rivers, and we're seeing that these deer and elk are moving closer to cities, which is causing problems for real citizens. And Eli's kind of brought up this idea that it's better if we do this naturally. He's saying that this is an environment that they're unaccustomed to, but honestly, I would say that if they're already moving in naturally, that shows that this is an environment that they can adapt to properly, and by doing a concerted effort to reintroduce them, we will see the benefits of decreased elk and deer populations, less harms to our environment. So super important that we do this.
Lily, thank you for that. And now card question number 3, and you've both touched on this a bit, but I'll ask the question, and Lily, you'll have 1 minute to respond. How has Yellowstone's flora and fauna benefited from the reintroduction of gray wolves?
Yeah, so if you look at the reintroduction of gray wolves in Yellowstone, it has been incredibly beneficial. Not only have populations been better controlled, but as I mentioned in my opening statement, these populations of elk and deer are much healthier. As we can see with overpopulation currently, disease is able to spread fairly quickly, but when they reintroduced gray wolves, they've been able to create healthier populations of elk and deer by weeding out those who are struggling. They've, in general, just seen a more balanced ecosystem, and it's been incredibly beneficial.
Thank you, Lily. Eli, your turn to answer that question. The last question in this round of questions submitted by forum organizers: how has Yellowstone's flora and fauna, vegetation, and wildlife benefited from the reintroduction of gray wolves?
Yellowstone has benefited a lot from the reintroduction of gray wolves. However, we aren't bringing gray wolves back to Yellowstone, we're bringing them back to Colorado. And so we have to be incredibly conscientious about how we do this. Unfortunately, Proposition 114 is putting this as a ballot box issue instead of an environmental one, showing that the government is forcing it on a mandate of the people instead of actually letting scientists decide how this is getting done. Unfortunately, the ecosystem is very different in Colorado than in Yellowstone, and so we might need a different style of wolf relocation program. The whole reason why it is important to not take wolves out of an ecosystem is because ecosystems are incredibly complex. So this is not a decision that can just be put to everybody, but one that actually needs thoughtful and nuanced discussion among experts in their fields.
Eli, thank you. Lily, thank you. That brings us to the end of the Q&A during this debate on Proposition 114. And now we move on to your closing statements. Each of you will have 1 minute for a closing statement, and we will reverse the order of the opening statements, which means we begin with you, Eli. Eli is a senior at George Washington High School on the speech and debate team. Eli, you have 1 minute for your closing statement.
Coloradans should vote no on Proposition 114 because it could cause environmental damage, but it is also a form of unnecessary government action. Wolves are naturally relocating themselves to Colorado at a pace that makes sense for them. It shouldn't be the government trying to swoop in and force them in. But also, this comes at a cost to Coloradans. Not only are the wolves being forced, but they're being forced at the expense of our taxpayer money. It will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in multiple years to try to relocate the wolves. But it is not only these upfront costs that taxpayers will pay, but there will also be costs across the Colorado economy. Ranchers could take a hit if their cattle are killed, and hunters may not pay for licenses, which not only means that they aren't hunting, but also services that their licenses pay for aren't getting the funding that they need.
Eli, thank you for that closing statement. And now, Lily, your turn to deliver your closing statement.
It is critical that Colorado voters vote yes on Proposition 114. Doing so will bring a desperately needed balance to our ecosystem. There are 2 key reasons to vote in favor of 114. First, gray wolves will be able to regulate deer and elk populations, and as a result, we will no longer see the harms to our environment that we are seeing in the status quo. We'll be able to prevent further erosion to our rivers, which can have detrimental effects not only on the environment but Colorado citizens. 114 will encourage the creation of an environment where both wolves and deer and elk can thrive, discouraging them from moving further into the cities. Second, gray wolves will promote the stability of elk and deer herds by weeding out the sick and vulnerable, which will in turn prevent disease spreading as quickly as it is now. It's super important that, as we can see by the benefits of 114 are real. The hypothetical harms that Eli provides you are we have no evidence that they're actually going to happen. We can see that the benefits will. It's the best option for Coloradans and for our environment.
Lily, thank you. Time's up. Eli, thank you. Time is up. We appreciate the respectful and healthy debate here between both of you. Again, they are seniors at George Washington High School, and on behalf of the forum organizers, I'd like to thank you both for participating in this forum. And on a personal note, I've met both Lily and Eli outside of this forum, and I can tell you that they're just as articulate and well-spoken out there as they are on the debate stage. So thank you both. You're both on to do very good things with your futures. And a special thank you goes out to the speakers, to both of the sets of parents of these speakers, and to Miss Mary Rose Cohen, the coach of the George Washington High School debate team. We won't declare a winner of this debate, but hope that the voters of Denver are winners by receiving a fair and balanced look at the pro and con arguments for Proposition 114. Again, Proposition 114 asks Colorado voters this November, should we reintroduce gray wolves on certain lands west of the Continental Divide? Our thanks also to Denver Decides and its partners, which include the Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation and the League of Women Voters of Denver. Denver Decides is presented by Denver 8 TV. Remember, Election Day is Tuesday, November 3rd. Let your voice be heard, be sure you are registered, and be sure to vote. For complete election information online, go to denverdecides.org. I'm Russell Haythorn with Denver 7. Thank you for joining us.